Yes, it's a pleasure to be here and actually see people. The last 3 years we've been working pretty hard, and a lot of people that I worked with I never actually met till the end of the project. So hopefully I'll see you today too. Today this presentation is going to look at conserving the threatened mammals, small mammals in the Otways, and their significant refuges and species management. I'd like to thank my co-authors, and I'd like to acknowledge, as has been stated, all the people that collaborated in this part of the project in the last 3 years. An absolute exceptional team. It really does make me a little bit emotional about the young people that I've worked with over the last 3 years and a few of the older ones. But in the centre you'll see the Wild Otways team led beautifully towards the end of the project by Jessica Miller. So I acknowledge Jessica and all the other partners, our on-country work with Wadawurrung, our team people that helped us in the field, Gorkap are our research students, and it really is an amazing collaboration, so I thank all those people. So why mammal refuges? Well, today and recently, it's quite true in many places that regional persistence of mammals is often reliant on the presence of refuges because of the changes in our climate, etc. So in these refuges, you get favourable environmental conditions, higher resource availability, and protection from disturbances such as fire, predation, and thermal and water stress. So you might be thinking about a long unburnt gully or rocky outcrops if you're in the deserts or gullies. What we need to do is to understand the characteristics of these, how the species use them, and where they are across the landscape, so we can actually focus our management. My work over many decades in the Eastern Otways found that we had a really healthy mammal communities in this area. We had now endangered species which weren't endangered, but specific species like the swamp antechinus, which were present at 30 sites in this area. They like the dense heathland, and we had very high populations. And of course, we had some really high rainfall, and those populations were doing really well, but then they became extirpated when we had drought. The New Holland mouse had a similar story, but they're in different habitat. They were present at 17 sites, and in some cases, very high density populations. They increased when there was increased rainfall. Then they declined precipitously after drought. And there was a whole lot of other species that were present with high site occupancy across the landscape. So we were interested in how these species work, what the populations did, how they reproduced, etc. We returned to the area in 2013, and between 2013 and 18, we had some really devastating results. New Holland mouse was not captured. We haven't had any captures since 2002. Swamp antechinus, there were only 8 individuals between 2013 and 15, and none in the next year. The woodlands, the low forests, the sandy heaths and the headland scrubs were all very devastated in terms of the mammals, and they had severe declines in species richness as well. So this was all, we have significant results that it was related to the millennium drought. The only good thing we had was that the coastal dunes and gullies had actually high abundance of mammals and species richness, and they included some threatened species such as the swamp antechinus. So we realised there were some important refuges in this landscape, and they're the coastal dunes that I mentioned, and that's me in Hutt Gully. I never knew I'd be crawling around in gullies and waterways when I returned to the area, but that's the way it was. And this is despite the presence of predators. So the Wild Otways initiative expanded the focus of that program to identify the spatial location of the threatened mammals across the landscape, And those are the species mentioned there that are all listed under the EPBC Act. Southern brown bandicoot, long-nosed pot, swamp antechinus, the broad-toothed rat, New Holland mouse and the smoky mouse. And also we were tasked with developing the Otway species management plan for those. So that was nested under the federal management plans and probably more relevant to the area that we're working in. So the work that we did over the last 3 years was to survey for the threatened mammals, and we were also chasing these refuges. We did a lot of camera trapping and live trapping, and our colleagues at the zoo, who are here today, did the broad-toothed rat surveys where they look for scats rather than the animals, which identify where the broad-toothed rat occurs. We found locations of the threatened species, and we mapped these refuges across the landscape. And we've developed spatial attributes for the land management teams, so they know where these refuges are, and when they're working, they'll have brief management guidance for each refuge. For example, if they're doing planned burns or bushfire, phytophthora management, weed management. And then we, as I said, we developed these Otway region species management plans. So they're nested under the National Threat Abatement Plans and the Species Recovery Plans and the Threatened Species Scientific Advice. And I think it's important because that kind of work sometimes sits up here and doesn't get down here, although there are some exceptions to that. So just looking at our map of our refuges, all that we have identified across the Otways, we identified 39 micro-refuges, which were only 12 micro-refuges, which are only about 39 to 300 hectares. We arbitrarily designated them. Some mid-connected refuges, which connect patches, and macro refuges, which are up to about 4,000 hectares. We only had 3 of them. So you can see that some of the large ones over on the left are indeed Carlisle and the Egan's Hargraves area. You can see the tiny size of some of the micro refuges down across the coast. And here we have the species that occur in these refuges. So quite often, a number of the threatened species are co-occurring. And even though there's small patches of micro-refuges, in our landscape, they are important. So we have to think about management at that level. What are the risks to these refuges? Well, there are many, but one that we've identified or has been identified in the Victorian Coast Kit area is the risk of erosion vulnerability to the sand dunes, particularly where the mammals are occurring. And you will have all seen, and some of you are working on the decline of sand dunes across the coast. So there's the vulnerability map. Red is areas that are predicted to actually have gone in 5 years' time. And some of them, we can see, this is a coastal dune with the Great Ocean Road just there. So a high risk of some of those dunes for the mammals. So we've gone through all of the refuges and we've described them, and then we've looked at that erosion vulnerability so people can work with it. We've also done things like listed the Phytophthora vulnerability for those refuges so that we can think about managing them. We've also looked at just the major key active mitigation and management of the threats. So these are the general prioritisations. We think we need to prioritise which refuges we need to protect. We have to assess that erosion vulnerability, and we're going to have to start thinking about moving animals because we don't want to just lose them to flooding or whatever happens. We're going to have to think about translocations, and Gemma will be talking about some examples that we've trialled. We have to think about optimum fire regimes and prescriptions, how we can maintain areas of dense vegetation because many of the species require it, the swamp antechinus, the southern brown bandicoot, long-nosed potteroo. We have to think about managing Phytophthora in the refuges and the surrounding habitat. Weed management, and a lot of you are involved in that, which is great. We've been working with Colac on the dunes. I think we need to think about intensive local scale predator control around these refuges. And we need to think about restoring habitat connectivity and developing conservation covenants on lands with high value. And some of them are already starting, which is really fantastic. And we have a range of people that we work with will have in their hands the management of these areas. I just want to talk a little bit, okay, what is a macro refuge? Well, Carlisle Heath is our best example. And in 2019-20, we did some work there and we had high success trapping in the gullies and lower success upslope in our heathy woodlands. But it was very species diverse, so from potoroos to pygmy possums to white-footed dunarts, feather-tailed gliders, and about 3 species of antechinus. But we weren't really sure about the abundance of species, so in 2021, Kristen Agosta did a detailed study of the swamp antechinus there, and indeed it turned out to be the most frequent species at most of the sites, 72% of the sites, and a high trap success. Now that sounds fantastic, but we revisited that area in 2023 and 17% of these sites recorded 0 swamp antechinus. So what you see is not always what you get in the future. Some of these sites had been burnt, but others hadn't. So there's a big question mark there about what's going on. However, the large areas of interconnected wet heath are really little micro refuges in the macro refuge, and they are surrounded by heathy woodland. So we need to assess at the landscape level, but then at the micro refuge level for our management and management activities. A micro refuge, one that's turned out to be quite important, is Colac Creek, linked to Lot 2, as I call it. So Colac Creek is at Aireys Inlet, and we had swamp antechinus there early in the 2000s, but in between that time and just recently, there were no swamp antechinus. And we also had a broadtooth rat record. Mick Lockman, who you see up there on the left-hand side as a photo, is developing a refuge on his property called Lot 2, up there in that green circle there. And he came to me with a dead swamp antechinus a few years ago. And we realised that maybe there were swamp antechinus in the area. And we conducted trapping in collaboration with them right along from the Lot 2 right down to the sand dunes at the Colac Creek estuary there. It was interesting. We found native mammals on Mick's property and agile antechinus and some swamp rats, which are really doing well at the moment as he's revegetated. And right down at the estuary, north and south of the bridge, we found swamp antechinus. And we found quite a good population of swamp antechinus. And they were breeding, the females were breeding, which is really great. But the last time we trapped there, we only had females. And so we were a bit worried, where are the males? What's the population going to do? Well, we went on holiday, which is a really great idea, because our local people who we'd trained recently kept their eyes out, and they found 10 of the dead antechinus. This species, when it mates, the males die afterwards because of stress. And they found 10 of them, they've collected them, and it means that the males did breed, that population is going to breed. And we've also used those specimens to, the zoo are going to do some more genetic work. So an amazing collaboration there. How am I going for time? 10?
12 minutes now.
It's 12. Okay. We have done our maps of the threatened species locations. Probably all I can say there is that these are the numbers of locations that we found them. Southern brown bandicoot seems to have declined. We've increased the locations of swamp antechinus. Broadtooth rat's doing pretty well at 40 sites out of 60, and the potteroo is doing very well in areas like Carlisle, but not in the eastern Otways. We've got some key recommendations for each of these species, but I'll leave that. I guess I'll leave that in detail. But one of the most important things that we think should be assessed is to establish some fenced refuges for multiple species. And the reason that is that during the Wild Otways program, rewilding was assessed, but it was only assessed for individual species. And we think there would be a really big cost benefit for some fenced areas so that we can have insurance populations. And we've identified some areas in the east and in the west where you would have habitat for a number of different species. So that's something we think should be entertained in the future. Just a couple of points to wind up there. I think the projects have produced a legacy, and the CMA, PV, DECA, community and traditional owners have all worked with us. They all will have the data, and they will have these management plans and the opportunity to implement them. We need to probably assess the viability of these refuges. As I said, some of them are at risk, and some of them might be really just sinks where the animals aren't reproducing. We need to think about some translocations out of the sinks, for example, from the coastal dunes. We need to think about appropriate fire regimes with climate change approaching, present. Predator control at the scale of the refuges, and some effective phytophthora management. And then I've again highlighted probably an option for some fenced predator-free refuges as insurance populations. We do know that the 2019-2020 fires in east of Australia took out thousands of animals and a lot of endangered species. So thank you very much.